Yes.
So before turning to how the £500,000 was spent, just a couple of points that we have checked over the break. The first refers to the point that you raised from Dr. Biggs' letter to the Lancet, where she said that 3 commercial companies are now licensed to sell good quality human factor rate in this country. And that is from a letter dated the 29th of June 1974. I'm afraid we haven't got to the bottom of this because Hemofil and Cryobuline were licensed in 1973, as we know. The third license, as you said, sir, is Profilate, the product from Abbott, which was dated May 1975. And then Co-8 and Factor 8 follow in 1976. Now, we know from the previous presentations that several of these products were available on a named patient basis at an earlier stage. We also know from a document that was referred to in the earlier presentations that there were promotional materials from Profilate in the Oxford Haemophilia Centre archive from 1973. The reference of that is BPLL 308067. And we can see a compliments sheet signed by Dr. Bidwell there, and also evidence of Dr. Rizza having seen it. Obviously, Dr. Biggs worked in the same centre, so it is possible that she saw those promotional materials. We don't know if those were promotional materials that were provided to the UK market, or whether or not they were materials that were obtained from the United States by somebody connected to these clinicians and brought back to the UK. But in any event, the license is not granted before Dr. Biggs's letter of June 1974. So we are not sure why she refers to 3 companies being licensed. Perhaps she is confusing a product which is provided on a named patient basis with a licensed product, or perhaps we have missed something, but we don't know.
Well, if you keep on looking, I'd be grateful. It may simply be that she's seen a change of name from the producer, which isn't a real change of name. We know that happened. It may be something like Spaywood, which she has in mind. I don't know. But if we can work it out, we will. Otherwise, we'll have to rely upon what we know from other materials. And it's a mistake she's not available to us to explain.
Yep. What I would say is from the documents that we looked at in November, when Dr. Walford comes in the early 80s to try to tot up who is providing which products, those are the products that she refers to. There is no other licensed product within the United Kingdom that she is referring to at that time.
Yes.
So, I'm afraid I can't assist more than that at the moment.
There would be perhaps some indication given if we looked at the UK HCDO returns and saw what was on their list, if they had a list at that stage, for the different sorts of concentrates, because they did have pretty early on a list, didn't they?
I believe so. There is ongoing work trying to put together all of the returns and interrogate them in order to provide some useful data for you. We will feed this question into that.
But it doesn't, this particular little point, it's intriguing, but it doesn't actually affect your presentation on self-sufficiency, does it really?
No, it doesn't. No. A second point concerns Hansard references. The inquiry legal team, as I said, had identified the question that was posed of Dr. Owen following Dr. Biggs's letter as the first Hansard extract that we had found that referred expressly to Factor 8. We are grateful to the Collins team who've pointed out a question and answer in Hansard from the 15th of June 1966, in which Mr. Pavitt MP asked the Minister of Health what information he has of advances recently made in the treatment of haemophilia and if he will make a statement. And the answer given by Mr. Robinson is, and I quote it in full, concentrates of anti-haemophiliac factor have been available for some years in this country on a limited scale for the treatment of special cases, and arrangements are now being made for preparation on a wider scale. The method of preparation recently reported from the United States is under investigation in several centres here. That is the answer that was given on the 15th of June 1966.
Yes, but again, it's intriguing, isn't it? Because although I think that Keckwick and Wolfe developed a form of AHF concentrated in 1959, maybe 57, but certainly in the mid-50s, mid to late 50s. I don't think there was any great production of it for a while. And the reference to developments in the United States may refer to the method which Dr. Poole had found of using the cryoprecipitate, which he already knew existed, but using it for therapeutic purposes by being able to have a system of closed bags and isolate it without losing its efficiency.
It could do so. I'm afraid I cannot go any further beyond that Hansard answer.
Yes, but at least there is an answer, and there's something about that. So I'm grateful to Collins for having pointed that out.
Turning then to the £500,000, Appendix 3 to the main presentation is a detailed analysis prepared by the inquiry legal team on how that money was spent. And it is a centre-by-centre analysis at points. I'm not going to take you to all of the documents in that, or indeed take you to the substantive material that's contained there. It's there for people to read both on the website and on Relativity, should they wish to do so. What the appendix shows, if I may summarise it, is that the announcement of the £500,000 was followed by a dialogue between the DHSS and the regional centres. The regions were given targets by the DHSS for how many donations were expected of them. And they, in turn, provided indications to the DHSS about the amount of money that was going to be required for them to be able to make those donations. The discussions took into account local factors, and as we saw in the documents before the break, there was inevitably a degree of variation as to how much would have to be spent on different centres in order to increase production. There were extensive negotiations that followed, more extensive with some regions than with others. The target of donations rose from 275,000 to around 340,000 per annum, which was about a 20% increase. The reasons for that rise and the different figures are contained in the appendix. I don't think that I need to explain those now, but it's to do with different centres explaining how much they could reasonably expect to produce. The analysis of your team, which is supported by a spreadsheet as well, which is referred to in the appendix, is that just over £500,000 of special allocation funds were spent in the year 1975 to 1976. That is, if one includes the amount spent on BPL. And a further 433,000 was spent in the financial year 1976 to 1977. The money was spent on a wide variety of items. As I mentioned earlier, some of the centres were still collecting blood in glass bottles at that stage. And so some of the money was used to transfer to plastic bags. Equipment such as freezers and centrifuges were purchased, as was laboratory kit. Several centres required money to be spent on building works, often referred to as accommodation, within the budgeting documents. Others incurred additional staff costs. The position of Wales in this process isn't entirely clear. There was some prior consultation between the DHSS and the Welsh office before the announcement of the £500,000 funding, but it was for the Welsh office and not the DHSS to make the necessary funds available to the Cardiff Transfusion Centre. That said, there was an awareness that Cardiff was, and I quote one document which was written by Mr. Giddens, unlikely to be able to do much in the way of increasing its output of plasma. Mr. Giddens didn't explain the reason why that was so. The first set of regional targets that was sent out by the DHSS did contain a target for the Welsh Regional Transfusion Centre, but later documents don't. And there were discussions between the Welsh office and the DHSS about what was being done in respect of increasing plasma production. The results of this programme were that the target of about 340,000 additional donations for fractionation was achieved by mid-1977. That's about 2.5 years after the policy was announced. BPL also received sums, and those are set out in the Appendix 3. Those sums seem to have been part of BPL's annual budget rather than part of the special funding, and they were much smaller than the overall special funding. Dr. Lane, in his 5th draft proof of evidence, about which you'll hear much more later in the week, calculated that BPL received £58,000, and he says this was, and I quote, for the purchase of additional equipment. That sum allowed for a significant increase in production at BPL and PFL. The figures, which are set out in paragraph 111 of the written presentation, are that in 1973, production was estimated at 2.7 million international units per year. In 1975, that had dropped to 2.19 million international units per year. But it rose by 1976 to 6.1 million international units per year. And 1977, it's up to 11.5 million international units. We will go into those figures and the sources for those figures and their reliability a little more probably on Wednesday or on Thursday this week. But the short point to take from it is that BPL's production rose substantially in this period. The documents demonstrate that Dr. Owen asked for and received various updates on the progress of the scheme, and that he was engaged in the policy and keen to encourage more rapid progress where that was possible. The documents also show that officials were aware of the importance that ministers, and in particular Dr. Owen, attached to this scheme. I won't go through the references, but they're at paragraph 113 of the written presentation. One document that I will take you to is at DHSC 301774. Please, Paul. This is a minute that was sent by Mr. Jackson on the 11th of July, 1975, and it is sent to Mr. Lillywhite, who I understand to have been Dr. Owen's private secretary. And it is a minute that is sent in response to a parliamentary answer which has been given to a question that was posed on the 22nd of April. It's not a question that I took you to earlier, but Dr. Owen on that occasion said that I hope that the NHS can become self-sufficient in the production of all forms of factor VIII within 2 or 3 years. And you will see from the opening paragraph of this minute that Dr. Owen commented on that. Once again, we're at a 2 to 3 year timescale. I've asked if we can improve on this. Can I have a note? So that is Dr. Owen chasing civil servants for an update about this. And this is what Mr. Jackson provides in response. If we pick it up from paragraph 2. Since then, which is since the parliamentary question, as a result of our discussions with regions, we have given them targets which would produce plasma from 337,000 blood donations. This is some 20% more than the total of 275,000 recommended by the expert group on haemophilia, but that figure must be regarded as the minimum, and minimum is underlined. All regions except 2 have now indicated when they expect to achieve their share of the target of 337,000. And there is a summary of the table there showing that by June 1977, 87% of the target is expected to have been achieved, and the 2 other regions make up the remaining 13%. In paragraph 4, Mr. Jackson says, the main reason why the programme cannot be completed earlier is that in 4 regions, extensive alterations have to be made to the transfusion centres before they are in a position to provide more plasma. In one case, the work will take 6 months, in 2 cases 1 year, and in the 4th, 21 months. Paragraph 5. We are taking steps to clarify the position of the 2 regions whose ability to contribute to the programme is at present uncertain. And then paragraph 6. It is difficult to be precise in estimating a date for achieving self-sufficiency, not least because not all are agreed as to what constitutes self-sufficiency. Some haemophilia centre directors envisage prophylactic treatment, whereas the department's programme is based upon home treatment of those patients for whom treatment at home can be recommended. It remains to be seen whether RTDs will be successful in persuading clinicians to accept a steadily increasing proportion of blood in the form of concentrated red cells. This may be a possible limiting factor. AHG concentrate has not previously been prepared in the NHS on the scale envisaged, and this in itself will almost certainly give rise to some problems. However, accepting these qualifications, the figures in paragraph 3 suggest we can improve on the previous estimate of achieving self-sufficiency within 2 to 3 years. We can now say that we expect to be self-sufficient within 2 years, or alternatively, that within about a year, we will be able to meet some 2/3 of present requirements and become self-sufficient in 1977. That was sent to Dr. Maycock and to Dr. Waiter, and we know that it was seen by Dr. Owen because on the first page, the top right-hand corner, sorry, can we, the top right-hand corner of the first page, please, Paul. Could you just scan out on the first page so we have the whole thing? Doesn't seem to be coming up on my screen, at least. Perfect, thank you. We can see some handwriting in the top right-hand corner, which reads, this is excellent, and I recognise that everyone is doing everything possible. I believe we should keep up the pressure. Can I be kept informed on the centrifuges and also the two regions? Why are there difficulties and what can be done? I would not easily accept that they should not contribute. And that is handwriting from Dr. Owen. We can see within that minute Mr. Jackson discussing the different definitions of self-sufficiency. Before, at the end of that minute, saying that it can be stated that we expect to be self-sufficient within 2 years, which is from July 1975. Lord Owen returns to Parliament in July 1975, 7th of July 1975, where he described the government's policy as being, and I quote, to make the NHS self-sufficient in the production of Factor VIII as soon as practicable. In a letter to Andrew Bennett MP, dated the 4th of December 1975, he used similar terminology, and I quote, I regard it as most important that the National Health Service should become self-sufficient as soon as practicable in the production of AHG concentrate. He went on to explain that funding had been provided by the DHSS and said, and I quote, I hope that in about a year we will be able to meet some 2/3 of the present requirements for AHG concentrate, and that within 2 years we may be able to reach the target we have set ourselves. The references for those documents are at paragraph 115 of the written presentation. On the 29th of April 1976, Dr. Owen addressed the World Federation of Haemophilia Congress. This is a document that you've been taken to before during Lord Owen's evidence. It is LDOW 5045. This is the text of Lord Owen's speech to the closing ceremony of the World Federation of Haemophilia, which was held at the DHSS building in Elephant and Castle. I won't read the whole thing, but if we pick it up from the second paragraph, Dr. Owen says this. This is, of course, the World Federation of Haemophilia, and I would like to state quite clearly to you how strongly I believe all the nations of the world should support the objectives and the policies of the World Health Organization, and none more so than in the policy of the WHO that each country should be able to supply its own blood and blood products to meet clinical needs. The previous speaker, Dr. Rosemary Biggs, told you quite bluntly the facts, which are that the NHS was not, at present, able to provide sufficient Factor VIII concentrate needed by haemophiliacs in this country for the management of bleeding, and that health authorities are having to buy expensive imported products. I think we ought to have made ourselves self-sufficient rather earlier than we will now be able to do so. But we have made the decision, in principle, to become self-sufficient. We have made a special allocation of £500,000 last year, and substantial progress, I'm glad to say, is now being made in building up production capacity in our country. And self-sufficiency of home-produced Factor VIII we expect to be reached around the middle of 1977. There is still some argument about the overall level of supply that we should be aiming at, and I am not certain that we have necessarily got it right at the moment. It might well be that as it becomes more readily available, the products will be used more effectively. But I cannot stress enough to you, as an international congress, that I think all nations, particularly the richer nations of the world, ought to be able to be self-sufficient and not to drain the supplies which are often much needed in other countries in the world. You will see there, sir, that there is a degree of nuance in what Dr. Owen is saying about the debate about the level that should be aimed at. If we go to the press release which accompanied that speech, which is at LDOW 5044, we can see in the third paragraph, I quote, "Following a special allocation of £500,000 last year, substantial progress was now being made in building up production capacity in the NHS, and self-sufficiency in home-produced factor 8 was expected to be reached in mid-1977. That is the press release, and that doesn't have a reference to the discussion about the overall supply. Dr. Owen left the Department of Health in 1976, and so he wasn't in post when the targets set by the DHSS were achieved in 1977. The following year, Max Madden MP tabled a series of written questions on self-sufficiency, which were answered by the then Secretary of State, Mr. Roland Moyle. If we could go to those, please, Paul. It's DHSC 40291. I will read through the entirety of this exchange. These are written questions and written answers. Mr. Madden asked the Secretary of State for Social Services, in view of ministerial statements made in 1976, indicating that Great Britain would be self-sufficient in factor 8, used in the treatment of haemophilia, by the middle of 1977, if self-sufficiency has been achieved, and if it has not, if he will explain the reasons. I pause there, sir, just to say that the reference to ministerial statements made in 1976 might be a reference to the press release and what Dr. Owen said at the World Federation of Haemophilia. The inquiry legal team haven't been able to find references in Parliament from 1976. Mr. Moyle's answer is this. The production target of factor 8 set for June 1977 was attained. However, new opportunities in the treatment of haemophilia and associated disabilities have been developed which have made further clinical demands for factor 8. Mr. Madden asked the Secretary of State for Social Services how much of the authorised amount referred to in ministerial statements made in February 1975, indicating ministerial authorisation for the allocation of up to £500,000 to increase the existing production of factor 8, especially in the form of a new concentrate within the National Health Service, had been allocated. Mr. Moyle answered, the whole sum was used to increase factor 8 concentrate production within the National Health Service. Mr. Madden asked the Secretary of State for Social Services how many units of factor 8 concentrate are being produced by each of the fractionation centres at Elstree, Oxford and Glasgow. Mr. Moyle answered, production of factor 8 concentrate at Elstree and Oxford is currently at the rate of approximately 15 million international units per annum. The National Blood Transfusion Service, in addition, produces approximately the same amount of factor 8 in the form of cryoprecipitate. I have no information about the production at Glasgow, but I have asked my Right Honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Scotland, to write to my Honourable friend about the production at Liberton, Edinburgh. Mr. Madden asked the Secretary of State for Social Services, what is the current shortfall between British National Health Service production of factor 8 and British demand for factor 8 concentrate? And if there is a shortfall, what action is being taken to remedy it? Mr. Moyle answered, The current amount of factor 8 produced in England and Wales is approximately 30 million international units per annum. Total usage of factor 8 in England and Wales is estimated to be approximately 45 million international units per annum. Regions are being asked to provide more fresh frozen plasma to the central processing laboratories where the National Health Service concentrate is produced. In the meantime, quantities of commercial factor 8 continue to be purchased to meet clinical demands. We could go over to the next page, please, Paul. Mr. Madden asked the Secretary of State for Social Services what additional central funding has been allocated to the blood transfusion service to improve blood fractionation. Mr. Moyle answered, in 1978 to 1979, a total of £145,000 has been allocated to the central processing laboratories in England to enable them to increase the production of blood products, mainly of factor 8 concentrate. Mr. Madden asked the Secretary of State for Social Services if the three fractionation plants supplying concentrate drugs for the treatment of haemophilia are working at full capacity and where supplies are allocated. Mr. Moyle answered, the Blood Products Laboratory at Elstree and the Protein Fractionation Laboratory at Oxford are both working at present full capacity, but this is being increased. Factor 8 concentrate is supplied by the central processing laboratories to the regional blood transfusion centres, who in turn supply the haemophilia treatment centres. Mr. Madden asked the Secretary of State for Social Services what is the cost of producing 1 unit of National Health Service factor 8 concentrate, what is the cost of importing 1 unit of factor 8, and if he will list comparable cost figures over each of the last 5 years. Mr. Moyle replied, detailed costing information in regard to the production of factor 8 is not available in the form requested, but the department is currently working on costing figures for blood products, which will include factor 8. It is not the practice to disclose National Health Service contract prices for purchased products. Mr. Madden asked the Secretary of State for Social Services what estimates have been made of balance of payment savings and reduced public expenditure if Great Britain were self-sufficient in the production of factor 8 concentrate by reducing dependence on expensive commercially produced supplies of factor 8. We could go on to the next section, please, Paul. Mr. Moyle replied, in the year ending 1977 to 1978, which is the latest year for which figures are available, the amount of expenditure for the purchase of commercial factor 8 for England and Wales was approximately £1.18 million. Although the product is imported by the suppliers, no information is available on the foreign exchange content of the purchase price. Because detailed costings of individual blood products produced within the National Health Service are not readily available, no estimate of a potential reduction in public expenditure has been made. So those are the answers that were given. The explanation given in response to the question about whether self-sufficiency was achieved was that the targets that were set were met, but that because of new opportunities in the treatment of haemophilia and associated disabilities, further clinical demands were made for factor 8. Of interest from the other answers, the fact that the collective output of BPL and PFL at that time was 15 million international units per annum, and that was said to be them operating at full capacity, but the capacity was being increased, and that's something we'll look at tomorrow. That's 15 million international units of factor 8 concentrate. A similar amount of cryoprecipitate was being produced by the National Blood Transfusion Service. That's 30 million international units overall. 45 million international units was the amount consumed, and so a shortfall of 15 million international units was being made up by commercial products. So on that analysis, it's about a third cryo precipitate, a third of domestic concentrate, and a third of commercial concentrate.
It doesn't deal with the Edinburgh contribution, does it?
But that is, he's answering purely for England and Wales because that is his departmental responsibility for the DHSS. What is slightly unclear is whether or not these answers cover Northern Ireland as well. But I'm afraid I can't assist on that. The amount allocated to PFL and BPL in England in 1978 to 1979 was £145,000. And that was said to be allocated to enable them to increase production of blood products, mainly factor VIII. The amount spent on commercial concentrates in the year 1977 to 1978 was £1.18 million for England and Wales. It can be seen, sir, from those answers that although the £500,000 investment had achieved the numerical targets that had been set for it, it had not ended the use of imported concentrates in the United Kingdom. I'm going to move on to a separate topic, sir. I wonder if that would be a good time to pause.
Well, probably we'd better be coming back to that tomorrow, I would think. So we'll take a break now and come back 10 o'clock tomorrow. 10 o'clock.